The night my daughter whispered 3 words into my ear, I was holding a glass of Shiraz and thinking about how lucky I was. That's the part that stays with me, how completely ordinary I felt in that moment. The fairy lights strung across the back veranda were reflected in the pool below. My wife Margaret had spent 3 weeks planning every detail of that evening, and it showed. 60-odd guests milling around our property in the Yarra Valley, laughing, clinking glasses, telling my daughter Sophie how radiant she looked. And she did look radiant. 29 years old, finally settled, finally happy, or so I believed. Her fiancé, Declan Marsh, was standing near the outdoor bar, delivering what I can only describe as a performance. Tall, well-spoken, with the kind of easy confidence that makes people lean in when he talked. He was telling a story about a hiking trip in New Zealand, gesturing just enough to seem animated without seeming loud. People were laughing. My wife was laughing. Even my son-in-law's mother, who I'd only met twice, was nodding along with genuine warmth. I remember thinking, he's good with people. I remember thinking that as a compliment. Then Sophie appeared at my elbow. She tilted her head toward me, close enough that I could smell her perfume, the same one she'd worn since university, and in a voice barely above a breath, she said, "Dad, don't let him touch the money." I turned to look at her. Her face was perfectly composed. She was still smiling, still holding her champagne flute, still playing the part of the glowing bride-to-be. But her eyes were telling me something else entirely. Before I could say a word, Declan called out from across the veranda, "Sophie, come here, Mum wants a photo." She squeezed my arm once, firmly, and walked toward him. I stood there with my Shiraz going warm in my hand, watching my daughter slide back into the party like nothing had happened. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer, mostly infrastructure projects across regional Victoria and later New South Wales. I am not a dramatic man. I do not catastrophize, but I will tell you this. I have never in my life felt a chill move through me the way it did in that moment. Standing on my own veranda, watching a man I had welcomed into my family laugh and raise his glass to the crowd. Something was very wrong. My daughter had just told me so. I want to go back, because this is the part I keep returning to. The part where I ask myself why I didn't act sooner. The honest answer is that I did notice things. Small things. The kind of things that don't quite add up but that you push aside because the alternative explanation feels unkind. Sophie had met Declan 11 months earlier at a property investment seminar in Melbourne. She'd gone with a friend from work, mostly out of curiosity, and she came home talking about this man who'd sat next to her and spent the entire lunch break asking her questions about her job, her family, her interests. "Not in a pushy way," she said. In a genuinely curious way, he told her he was a property developer, mid-sized projects, mostly inner suburban Melbourne, a couple of things in Brisbane. He mentioned a business partner named Kevin. He mentioned being previously married, no children, amicably separated. He said he'd grown up in Perth, moved east in his late 20s, built things slowly and carefully. He was 41 years old, and he presented as a man entirely at ease with himself. The first time I met him was about 6 weeks after they started seeing each other. Margaret and I had them over for Sunday lunch. He brought a very decent bottle of Margaret River Cabernet and spent 10 minutes talking to me about the Westgate Bridge project. Genuinely knowledgeable, historically accurate, interested in the engineering rather than just the spectacle. I was impressed, despite myself. But there was a moment, toward the end of lunch, that I have thought about many times since. I mentioned, offhandedly, that Sophie was the sole beneficiary of a family trust, nothing elaborate. I wasn't making an announcement. It came up naturally in conversation about estate planning. Declan set down his fork, just for a second. Then he picked it up again and said, That's very forward-thinking of you, Graham. A lot of families don't plan that far ahead. It was a perfectly reasonable response. There was nothing wrong with it, but I noticed the pause. I filed it away, and then, because he was charming, and Sophie was happy, and the Cabernet was excellent, I left it there. I didn't investigate. That's my regret. I am a man who has spent his career identifying structural weaknesses before they become failures, and I noticed a hairline crack and chose to look away. After the engagement party, I didn't sleep. Margaret noticed. Of course, she always does, but I told her I'd had too much coffee late in the evening, which was not entirely a lie. I lay in the dark and turned Sophie's words over and over. Don't let him touch the money. Not I'm having second thoughts. Not I'm a bit nervous. Not the ordinary pre-wedding anxiety that any sensible parent might hear from a daughter 3 months out from her wedding date. She had said something specific. She had chosen her words carefully, and she had chosen her moment carefully. A room full of people. A second where no one would notice, where she could say it and retreat without anyone seeing. She had been planning to tell me. She had waited for the right moment. The next morning I rang her before 8. She answered on the second ring, which told me she'd been awake too. I need you to tell me everything, I said. Not the version that protects his feelings. Everything. There was a long pause. Then she said, "Can you come to the flat?" "Not with Mum. Just you." I was in my car within 20 minutes. Sophie lives in a ground-floor flat in Fitzroy, the kind of suburb that's changed enormously since I was young. We sat at her kitchen table with instant coffee. She's never been much of a cook, and she told me what had happened. 4 days before the engagement party, she'd come home from work early. A migraine, she gets them occasionally. Always has. Declan was out. His laptop was open on the kitchen bench, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that she glanced at the screen and saw a spreadsheet. She almost didn't look. She'd told herself later that she almost just walked past. But something caught her eye. A column of names. Her name in a column beside a number with a lot of zeros attached to it. She sat down and she looked at the spreadsheet properly. There were 6 names in total. Sophie's was the most recent. The column headers read, name, relationship, status, est, asset value, trust, estate, Y, N, timeline, stage. Her row read, Sophie Alderton, engaged, $2, 3M, family trust, Y, 8 months, stage 4. She took photos on her phone. She closed the laptop. She went to bed and lay there with her migraine and what she now knew. And she waited. She hadn't confronted him. She told me she was frightened, not physically frightened. She was clear about that, but frightened of what would happen to the plan, to the evidence. If she showed her hand too soon, she'd had 4 days to think about it, and she'd decided she needed me first. I looked at my daughter across that kitchen table, and I felt 2 things simultaneously. The first was a grief so sharp it was almost physical grief for the version of the last 11 months that had just been retroactively dismantled. The second was a cold, clarifying fury that I recognized from my working life as the thing that had always made me good at my job. I asked to see the photos. I looked at them carefully. 6 names, 6 women, stages 1 through 4. Sophie was stage 4. What do you think stage 4 means? I asked. I think it means he was about to make his move, she said. I asked her if she still had the keys to his car. She did. I asked her if he had any documents, lease agreements, investment proposals, anything financial stored at the flat. She found a manila folder in the bottom of his wardrobe. Inside were 3 documents. A draft joint investment agreement with Sophie's name already filled in, a letter from a solicitor in Brisbane that referenced a property transaction that had fallen through due to partner withdrawal, and a printed email chain between Declan and someone referred to only as RT, discussing the Alderton situation and the phrase, "move before the wedding, not after." I photographed everything. I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it. Then I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a forensic accountant named Patricia Nguyen, who had worked on a fraud case tangentially connected to a construction project I'd been involved with years ago. I'd kept her number. The second was to a retired detective I'd gone to school with in Ballarat, a man named Ron Castles, who had spent his career in financial crime before retiring to a small farm near Daylesford. Ron picked up on the third ring and listened without interrupting while I told him what Sophie had found. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Graham," he said, "the fact that she's stage 4 and the wedding is 3 months away, that's not a coincidence. How much access does he have to her right now? Financially, I mean." "None yet," I said. "She hasn't added him to anything." "Good. Keep it that way. Don't tip him off. Let Patricia start pulling threads. I want to be honest about why I hadn't investigated Declan earlier. Because I know it's the obvious question, and it deserves a real answer. The truth is multi-layered. Partly it was that Sophie was 30 and capable of her own choices, and I had spent her entire adult life trying not to be the overbearing father who made her feel surveilled. I had watched other fathers drive their daughters away with exactly that behavior, and I didn't want to be that man. Partly it was that Declan was skilled. He was skilled in the way that people who do this for a living become skilled. He had learned which details to offer and which to withhold. How to be just verifiable enough that you stopped looking. He had a LinkedIn profile with genuine connections. He had a business address in South Melbourne that turned out, later, to be a shared co-working space, but which appeared legitimate on any surface inspection. And partly, I'll say it plainly, it was that he had made my daughter happy. And when someone makes your child happy after a period when they were not, you want to believe it. Patricia Nguyen worked quickly. Within 10 days, she had identified 3 of the other names on the spreadsheet and traced what had happened to them. The woman in the stage, one position a GP from Canberra, named in the spreadsheet only as Helen R., had apparently ended the relationship before it progressed. Patricia couldn't determine why. Stage 2 was a widow from Adelaide, who had given Declan access to a joint account for a property deposit and lost $180,000 before realizing the purchase had never existed. Stage 3 was a divorced woman from Sydney, who had lost significantly more. Patricia estimated between $400,000 and $500,000 through a series of investment contributions to a company that had been dissolved 3 months after she made her final transfer. In both cases, the women had not gone to the police, whether out of embarrassment, or because they felt partly responsible, or because they had simply tried to move on. Patricia didn't know. What she did know was that Declan Marsh was not his original name. His birth name, according to the documents she'd obtained through her own channels, was Daniel Marsh Connolly. He'd been the subject of a fraud investigation in Queensland 7 years earlier that had not resulted in charges, apparently due to insufficient evidence. He had since operated under at least 2 variations of his name. Ron Castles took what Patricia had found and contacted a colleague still working in the financial crimes unit at Victoria Police. The detective he spoke to, I never met her, but Ron told me she was formidable. "I need to tell you about the part that was hardest. Harder than the evidence, harder than the forensic accounting, harder than sitting across from Ron on his veranda in Daylesford, explaining what my daughter's fiancé had done to other women who had also been hopeful. The hardest part was Sophie. She held herself together with a discipline that I found both admirable and heartbreaking. For 3 weeks, she continued to behave normally. She had dinner with Declan. She discussed wedding venues. She sent emails about catering, about flowers, about the guest list. She did all of this while knowing what she knew, while carrying the weight of what was coming. and she did it because we needed time to build the case properly, and she understood that. Once she called me late at night, about 2 weeks in. She didn't say much. She just said, "Dad, I keep wondering if any of it was real." I didn't try to give her an easy answer. I don't think she wanted one. "I think the version of you that trusted him was real," I said. "I think your instincts were real too. They just needed time to get loud enough." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When's this going to be over?" "Soon," I said. "I promise." The arrest happened on a Wednesday morning. Sophie was at work, she had been told, and had agreed that it would be cleaner that way, that she didn't need to witness it. Two plainclothes officers attended the South Melbourne co-working space where Declan rented a desk 3 days a week. He was charged with fraud, obtaining financial advantage by deception, and identity-related offenses. His real laptop, the one he used for work, not the one Sophie had found open on the bench, was seized. Ron told me later that it contained documentation for 2 additional spreadsheets beyond the one Sophie had photographed. He had been doing this for at least a decade. The woman from Adelaide, when she was contacted by the investigating detective, agreed to cooperate. So did the woman from Sydney. Neither had spoken to the other before that phone call. The detective told Ron that both of them had said, almost identically, that they had blamed themselves, that they had spent years telling themselves they should have seen it coming. That detail lodged in me and hasn't left. Declan appeared in the Melbourne Magistrates' Court the following month. He did not look like the man who had stood on my veranda telling stories about New Zealand. He looked smaller. He was remanded on bail with conditions that prohibited him from contacting Sophie or any of the other women named in the charges. His legal representative made noises about the complexity of the case, and the matter was adjourned for mention. The full hearing was set for 8 months later. The outcome, when it came, was a sentence of 4 years and 3 months with a non-parole period of 2.5 years. The judge noted, in her remarks, the sophisticated and premeditated nature of the offending, the targeting of women in emotionally vulnerable circumstances, and the impact on victims who had subsequently struggled to trust their own judgment in relationships. Sophie was in the courtroom for the sentencing. I sat beside her. She listened to the judge's remarks with her hands folded in her lap and her back very straight. And when it was over, she turned to me and said, "Is it enough?" I thought about the women in Adelaide and Sydney and the years they had spent believing it was their fault. I thought about the GP in Canberra who had gotten out early and probably never knew how close she'd come. I thought about what 4 years means against what had been taken from those women, not just money, but the willingness to open themselves to someone, which is not a thing you can easily recover. "I don't know if it's ever enough," I told her, "but it's something." She nodded slowly. Then she stood up, picked up her bag, and walked out into the Melbourne afternoon. I followed her, and we went and had lunch, proper lunch, at a place she liked in Carlton, with a glass of wine and no discussion of spreadsheets or magistrates or any of it. We talked about her work, which she loves. We talked about Margaret's garden, which has gotten somewhat out of hand. We talked about her brother, who is about to become a father for the first time. We did not talk about what she would do next. Romantically speaking, that is her life and her timing and entirely her business. But she seemed not fine. Because fine is too simple a word, she seemed present. She seemed like herself. Sodium, fime, tamine, that is the thing I am most grateful for. I want to say something now that I've thought about carefully, because I think it matters. If you are a parent reading this, or listening to this, believe your children when they tell you something is wrong, even if they can only whisper it in a crowded room, even if the timing is strange, even if the person they're worried about seems entirely plausible. The fact that someone is charming is not evidence that they are trustworthy. These two qualities are, in fact, entirely unrelated. If you have a child who is entering a serious relationship, particularly one that involves access to family assets, property, trusts, or significant financial decisions, it is not an act of unkindness to ask questions. It is not cynicism. It is what a competent structural engineer does. You look for the load-bearing elements. You check the joins. You don't assume that something looks solid from a distance means it is solid all the way through. I spent 31 years doing exactly that for bridges and buildings. It would have cost me nothing to do it for the man my daughter was planning to marry. And if you are someone who has been through what the women in Adelaide and Sydney went through, the skill and patience required to deceive someone who has every reason to trust you is not a reflection of your judgment. It is a reflection of the deceiver's investment in the deception. These men, and they are not always men, but often enough they practice. They refine. They choose carefully. The fact that they chose you means they identified something worth taking. That is not a compliment about them. And it is not an indictment of you. Sophie told me recently that she started trusting her instincts again, that she had a moment at work a couple of months ago, something minor, a colleague's behavior that didn't add up, and instead of talking herself out of the feeling, she paid attention to it. It turned out she was right about the colleague, though in a much smaller and entirely non-criminal way. It's like a muscle, she said. You stop using it and it gets weak. But you can build it back. I think about that a lot. The quiet knowledge that something is wrong. The thing that made her lean in at her own engagement party, in front of 60 people who were all watching her fiancé raise a glass to their future and whisper to me instead of smiling and going along with it. That instinct was working the whole time. She'd just been trained, as many of us are trained, to second-guess it. Don't second-guess it. I am 63 years old, and the best piece of professional advice I ever received was from an older engineer on my first project, standing in front of a concrete pour that didn't look quite right. He said, "If something doesn't feel right, it's already telling you something. The question is whether you're listening." I should have listened sooner. My daughter listened in time. That is the difference between this story and the ones that end differently.